Hi friends, my name is Jenny and I'm back today to do another video. Today I'm going to be chatting through my Reading Women 2020 wrap-up. So in 2020 I completed the Reading Women challenge, or I attempted to complete it. We'll see some places where I kind of stretched the prompt a little bit, but I thought it would be fun to kind of go over the 24 prompts and what books I read, what I thought about those prompts, as some of the prompts were definitely a lot easier for me to complete than others. So I'm going to go through the books that I read for the 24 prompts, as well as kind of talk about each prompt in turn, and I would love to hear down in the comment section below if you read any of these same books for any of the Reading Women 2020 prompts, or if you are completing the Reading Women 2021 challenge. I am definitely working on the Reading Women 2021 challenge and I'm really excited about it, and I've actually made a whole video talking about my plans for completing the challenge, which I will link up in the cards above as well as in the description box below. So do check that out if you are interested. So let's just get into what I ended up reading for the Reading Women challenge. So the first prompt that I completed was an author from the Caribbean or India, and actually the book I picked kind of stretches that a little bit, but I definitely read several other books throughout the year that would have fit this prompt. So I ended up putting Queenie by Candice Carty Williams. Carty Williams actually was born in Britain, but her parents, I believe, are from Jamaica, so her kind of cultural heritage is from Jamaica, which is obviously part of the Caribbean. I really enjoyed this book. I read it way back in January of 2020, ended up giving it 4 stars, and while I definitely like the kind of prompts that are set in different places, as I feel like that does encourage you to read outside of your comfort zone, I actually found that pairing the Caribbean and India made this prompt quite easy for me, as those are both places that I read from a fair bit. I do remember, however, wanting to pick a book that fit the Caribbean aspect of this prompt, as I feel like I read a lot of authors from India or who are Indian American, etc. So I wanted to find a book that had a Caribbean perspective, and Queenie seemed to fit well for that. Then another prompt that I found fairly easy to complete was the prompt for a book over 500 pages, and for that in January I also read The Most Fun We Ever Had by Lombardo. Both of these books I actually put on my favorite books of the year, and this one I gave 4.5 stars, so I'll also put a link to that video up in the cards above if you're interested in that as well. But this one is definitely over 500 pages, and I don't particularly find myself someone who's like afraid of longer books, so I didn't find this challenge particularly difficult either. And in fact, as you can see, I read an over 500 page book written by a woman in January, so definitely one of the easier prompts for me to complete, and I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I talked about it, as I said, up in that favorite books of the year video if you want to check it out. Then yet another book that made my favorite books of the year. We can see a trend here. In these easier prompts for me, I found books that I enjoyed more, which I would say is less so the case for some of the more challenging prompts for me. But for a feel-good happy book, I picked Playing House by Ruby Lang. I gave this one 4 stars and also read it in January. In fact, I think this actually was the first book that I read, or the second book that I read in 2020, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's a romance novella and was just super fun all around, and definitely was a feel-good or happy book for sure. So the next prompt that was pretty easy for me was a favorite or new to you publisher, and for that the publisher I picked was Hub City Press, which was the original publisher of Whiskey and Ribbons. This since has been reacquired. I'm not entirely sure what that terminology is, but Leesa Smith was a different publisher, and I believe this book also went with her. I'm not entirely sure though, but this was Whiskey and Ribbons, which is a kind of contemporary fiction novel about this woman who has lost her husband. Her husband was a police officer, and his best friend, who's also a police officer, kind of are coming to terms with potentially their feelings for one another and the grief that they feel for the loss of this best friend slash husband. So I really enjoyed this one. I ended up only giving it 3 stars, but I did like Leesa Smith's writing style, and I've read several other books from Hub City Press, all of whom I believe were written by women, if I'm not mistaken. So this definitely is a favorite publisher of mine, and I was pleased to get several of their books under my belt during 2020, in part because of this challenge. Then in March of 2020, I read the first kind of meh book of this challenge, which was The Unspoken Name by A.K. Larkwood. I read this for the LGBTQ author prompt. I've read a number of books by LGBTQ authors throughout the rest of the year, but I did find that prompt a little bit challenging just because it's sometimes difficult to know an author's sexuality, and so this prompt kind of required a bit more digging than sometimes other prompts do, but I thought this book was fine. I didn't particularly love it. As you can see, I no longer have a copy with me. I did originally purchase one, and then I think I gave it to my sister because I didn't feel the need to keep it on my shelves. But this is a fantasy novel that came out in 2020, but I have read some other books by female LGBTQ plus authors later in the year that I did enjoy more. Another prompt that was fairly easy to complete just because I had a book that fit perfectly for this prompt, and it was a pretty easy book to get through because of the prompt was the under 100 pages prompt, and for that I read a poetry collection, 1000 Mornings by Mary Oliver. This one I think I just read in a single morning and I really enjoyed. It's like 97-ish pages or something, so this was a great choice for this prompt. I ended up giving this 4 stars and I read this back in April of 2020. So by this point I had started my channel, so I will be sure to put the wrap up where I talk about this book as well as any other books that I finished since starting my channel down in the description box below. So there is that one. I gave 4 stars, did enjoy it. Then for the probably biggest disappointment of my entire Reading Women 2020 challenge, which is incredibly ironic given the prompt that I ended up using for, which was a book that was frequently recommended to me just because it was all over BookTube. I was not personally recommended it, but I feel like every single person that reads romance, even like adjacent to the romance genre, was talking about and loving this book, which was Beach Read by Emily Henry. This one I ended up only giving 2.75 stars. I didn't really enjoy it. I didn't like the characters. I didn't find the plot of the romance to be all that fun, nor did I even find like the writing of the romance to be all that fun. So this was a pretty big disappointment for me, and I think I actually said it was the biggest disappointment in my like mid-year book freakout tag, and just not a success for me really whatsoever. I did read this in April of 2020, as I said, gave it 2.75 stars, perhaps reading books that people recommend to me on BookTube that seem to be all hyped up are not actually the books that I will enjoy. So there is that one. Then for the prompt, a book about food, and this one I actually thought would be easier to complete, so we're starting to get into prompts that were a little more challenging to complete. I thought this one would be easier to complete than it actually was because I love food and cooking, but there's not a ton of books, or it's not very easy to like look up books, I found. But luckily I got a book for my birthday that fit this prompt well, which was Eat Joy: Stories and Comfort Food from 31 Celebrated Writers, edited by Natalie Eve Garrett. So this one I read in April and is, as it says on the tin, 31 essays by different famous writers, including Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Mira Jacob, Melissa Febos, Colin McCann, and Lev Grossman. All sorts of different people are featured in here, basically talking about a moment in which food was really integral to kind of the emotions they felt at that point. And then they also include the recipe that they kind of talk about in this particular essay. So I thoroughly enjoyed this. There were some male authors included in here, so it felt a little bit of a cheat, but it also was the best book I felt that I read throughout the year that completed this prompt. So there is that one. Also in April, I ended up reading a book for a prompt that I did not even realize fit this prompt, which was from the 2019 Reading Women shortlist prompt. And for that, I read Women Talking by Miriam Taves. This one I actually got assigned to read for the BookTube prize, and I didn't realize that it was on the Reading Women shortlist until several months after I'd read it, so I just like quickly filled it in because I obviously had read it. And I did enjoy this one. I gave it 4 stars, and I do remember, you know, ranking it pretty highly throughout the BookTube prize. I'm not sure if I hadn't been assigned this book in the BookTube prize if I would have read it, but I did really enjoy it, and it was fun to have this book like filled out through another kind of project that was not the Reading Women challenge that also helped me to fulfill this prompt. So definitely kind of an indirect way of like using the Reading Women challenge to read books I may not have otherwise read. Then another prompt that I found very easy to complete, although the book that I picked I didn't read until May, which was the book about the environment, and for that I read The Story of More by Hope Jaron. I am obviously very passionate about the environment and sustainability and learning about climate change, so all of those topics are ones that I read about pretty frequently, so I was not expecting this prompt to be particularly challenging, but when I read this book for the Springathon, I thought that it fit perfectly. And I did enjoy this one. I gave it 4 stars, would recommend it if you are interested in learning more about climate change and kind of global environmental change more broadly. I would definitely recommend this one, and I'm happy that this was one of the prompts for the 2020 challenge, as I think that is a super important topic that perhaps not everyone is going to be picking books up on. And then finally, the last prompt that I found pretty easy to complete was the read and watch a book to movie adaptation prompt, and that was solely because that was also a Reading Rush 2020 challenge prompt. So I picked Ella Enchanted by Gail Carson Levine, and actually I didn't enjoy the book nearly as much as I enjoyed the movie. The movie for me is like a childhood classic, so I've seen it many times, and reading the book for the first time just really did not live up to the hype. The movie changed a lot of things I found for the better, which was definitely intriguing to read a book and enjoy the movie like substantially more than I enjoyed the book. So I only gave Ella Enchanted 3 stars, but I did read it and count it for both the Reading Rush and for the Reading Women 2020 challenge. Then moving into the kind of section of prompts that I found somewhat more challenging or had to do a bit more digging / they weren't books that I necessarily would have picked up on my own. The first of those was featuring a woman with a disability. Now I found this prompt to be super important and I'm really glad that they included it on the challenge, but I did find like through researching this prompt that definitely is a gap in my reading. That obviously that is the point of the Reading Women Challenge, so I was happy to complete it and kind of expand my horizons in that area, and I'm hoping to continue to do that moving forward. But the book that I ended up picking was my autobiography of Carson McCullers by Jen Chaplin. Jen Chaplin definitely does have a chronic illness. I don't remember, because I read this book back in April, and I don't think that Jen Chaplin ever says exactly what the chronic illness or disability that she experiences, but she definitely talks about having a disability quite a lot in this book, and also theorizes that Carson McCullers may also have had a very similar chronic illness or disability because of her many ailments that she experienced throughout her life. So there's definitely a lot of talk about illness and disabilities in this book, even though none are necessarily mentioned by name. So I thought this was a good pick for this prompt, and definitely a book that I would strongly recommend if you are looking for a kind of blending of genres nonfiction book. I really enjoyed this one back when I read it in April. Another prompt that was similar to the food prompt in that it was difficult to find books that kind of feature this. It's not necessarily a keyword that you can kind of look up, I found on the internet, was a book about a woman artist. So for this I ended up using City of Girls by Elizabeth Gilbert, as the main character in that book is a costume designer, but I had difficulty kind of determining if that was really considered an artist. So this prompt definitely got me thinking a lot about like what includes art, and if you have a profession that you make things for people, is that still art? That was something that I was kind of grappling with throughout thinking about this prompt, but I did end up using City of Girls just because I felt like this character makes art in a number of different ways. She's also kind of involved in the theater productions that are kind of central to the plot of this novel as well. So it felt like she was definitely in the art world and an artist of sorts. But again, another prompt that it was somewhat difficult to find books that I was both interested in but also featured artists in the way that I kind of traditionally think about art. Then another prompt that was a bit more challenging was the biography prompt, as I was trying to find a biography about a woman written by a woman because I thought that would kind of best fit the goals of the Reading Women Challenge. But then I found a book written by a woman that is a biography of a man, but it pushes back on a lot of the expectations and standards of the biography genre, which is You Never Forget Your First, a biography of George Washington by Alexis Coe. This is the first ever biography written of George Washington by a woman, so I felt like that definitely was an important enough idea that it should be counted for the Reading Women Challenge, and I thoroughly enjoyed this one. I read this back in June. I gave it 4 stars. Would highly recommend, even if you're not a big US president person. I think this book is using the biography genre in a really interesting way, and I think using the ideas of kind of intersectional feminism and very recent kind of historical research methods to uncover George Washington in a way that a lot of other biographies of him do not. Another prompt where I basically knew where I was going to read right from the beginning of the year, but it took me until July to finish, was the Afrofuturism prompt. And for this I read Binti Home by Nnedi Okorafor. I read the original Binti, the first in this trilogy, several years ago, probably back in 2018 I want to say, and I've just never finished the rest of the trilogy. So in July I decided to take on this prompt and another prompt that I'll get to in a minute to kind of fulfill these prompts and catch up with my Reading Women during the middle of the year. And I did enjoy Binti. I gave it 4 stars, and I do want to continue in the series, and I do love the ideas of Afrofuturism, but I'm not a big science fiction reader, which it seems that Afrofuturism is primarily found in the science fiction genre. So this became a bit of a challenging prompt just because many of the books, again, that fit for this prompt were not ones that I was necessarily explicitly interested in, which is always a goal of mine when trying to complete a reading challenge, is to find books that both fit the prompt but also are a book that I maybe would have read anyway. So Binti Home did work for this prompt and I did enjoy it. I think a lot of people probably read one of the Binti books for this prompt. Then another prompt that I struggled with a bit was the Inspired by Folklore prompt, and that was just in part because I wasn't entirely sure what really counts as folklore and what doesn't. So I know that was a bit of a discussion on the Goodreads community, but I ended up picking Drowned Country by Emily Tesh, and this unfortunately was kind of a miss for me. I only gave it 3 stars, and I do think it kind of includes some kind of folkloric elements, but at the same time I couldn't exactly pinpoint what folklore this was pulling from. So I assigned this book to this prompt, but this is one of the prompts where I'm kind of iffy on whether this would actually, if I was being really strict, which obviously that is not the point of a reading challenge, perhaps this wouldn't actually count towards this prompt, but this was another one that just like didn't quite work for me, and also was not a prompt that I was particularly super excited by. The next prompt that I had a bit of a challenge with, and this is another one of the prompts that was kind of up to interpretation, which also I find those types of prompts almost are more challenging for me, which is a book about a woman who inspires you. So for this one I ended up going with How to Fly in 10,000 Easy Lessons by Barbara Kingsolver, which is a poetry collection. Barbara Kingsolver definitely is an inspiration to me, but I wasn't entirely sure if poetry counts as being about a person or if it's really kind of more about themes. So this one was another one where I like hesitantly put How to Fly in 10,000 Easy Lessons as the book that fit this prompt, but again, if I was being more strict with myself, would I have chosen a different book? Perhaps. Then moving into a nonfiction by a female historian, this one was one of the prompts that I thought would be very easy when I started 2020, and I actually had a lot of trouble finding a book that was about a historical period that I was interested in, as well as written by a woman. I had another book on my shelf that I would have picked for this prompt, but I actually didn't finish it for 2020. But in Nonfiction November, I did read Revolutions by Hannah Ross, which is about how women changed the world on two wheels. And so this is kind of a like feminist examination of the history of bicycling. And I did enjoy this. I felt that it wasn't exactly as comprehensive as I think I really wanted it to be. It felt a bit more like vignettes, and actually Hannah Ross is not necessarily like a historian by trade, although since this is a history nonfiction, I figured it would count. But this was a prompt that I think I want to explore more in the future, because I am interested in reading more history nonfiction by women, but I might just kind of see what other people read for this challenge to see if any of those books kind of sound particularly of interest to me. Another prompt that was particularly challenging for me was the picture book by a BIPOC author, and this was challenging in part because I didn't exactly want to read a picture book, and also my library was closed for so much of 2020 that getting picture books through the library was challenging for much of the year. But I did actually end up picking a YA book that had illustrations in it, which was Alatsoi by Darcy Littlebadger. I thoroughly enjoyed this, and I feel like that the prompt can be stretched enough that this book still fits with the prompt given the illustrations. I thoroughly enjoyed this one. I read it during the last month of the year in December, and definitely was one of my favorite books I'd say I read for the challenge. So I'm really glad that I read this, but it was a book that, again, I was like, does this really count for the prompt? I'm not sure. But I did thoroughly enjoy Alatsoi and was very pleased that this reading challenge gave me an opportunity to read it. Another prompt that I didn't finish until the very end of the year that was at first a bit challenging just because I wasn't able to easily find an anthology by multiple authors that were all women. However, about halfway through reading New Daughters of Africa, edited by Margaret Busby, I realized that this would actually fit perfectly for this prompt. But as you can see, it's well over 500 pages. It's almost 1,000 pages. So it took me about 5 months to read this. So I'm glad that I finished it before 2020 so I could count it for this challenge. This was one that was definitely a project to get through, so it was a bit more challenging of a prompt to accomplish, and also finding an anthology about, again, a topic that I'm interested in that was all written by women was a bit challenging as well. Then another prompt that I found challenging that I want to explore in more depth, similarly to the nonfiction by a female historian, was a book by an Arab author. This, I realized over the course of my 2020 reading, is not an area of the world that I spend a lot of time in when I'm reading, and so I want to change that in future years starting in 2021, as I do think that this is a region of the world that I do want to pay more attention to, but I often find myself kind of gravitating towards other parts of the world. So for this prompt, I picked The Moors Account by Leila Lalami, and I thoroughly enjoyed this one. I also read this in December, and I gave it 4 stars. And Lalami is from Morocco, although I believe she lives in the United States now. And this was definitely another prompt that I'm looking forward to exploring more in the future. Then 2 prompts that I want to talk about in tandem because I found both of them more challenging than I initially anticipated they would be. The first of which was a book that was set in Japan or by a Japanese author, and so for this I picked Pachinko by Min-Jin Lee. Min-Jin Lee is actually a Korean author, but this book is talking about the Korean population that's living in Japan from the Japanese occupation of Korea all the way until like the 90s, I believe, if I remember correctly. And this was definitely an area of history that I know basically nothing about, so this book taught me a lot about that and also helped me realize how little I know about that part of the world. So I think this book, alongside the second prompt, which was a book translated from an Asian language, for which I picked Territory of Light by Yuko Tsushima, translated by Geraldine Harcourt. Both of these books helped me realize that while I do read a lot of books from India, I don't actually read all that much from the rest of Asia kind of to the east of India, so Southeast Asia, China, and Japan, all of which are countries that I'm interested in kind of exploring more about the work that's coming out of those countries, and also just learning more about the history of those countries, as that is not a region of the world that I really know that much about. So I was pleased by both of these prompts, although I did find them quite challenging to find books for, just again because it's really not an area that otherwise interests me, but I do want to make it more of a priority so that I can find more books that interest me, particularly translated works, as I found that the translation aspect of the Asian language prompt to be particularly challenging because I don't read that much translated fiction. And then finally, the last prompt that I found the most challenging, which I actually technically did not complete, but I'm going to count a book for it anyway, is the Stella Women's Prize winner. I find any time that a prize winner is featured on any reading challenge that I find it particularly challenging because it's just such a limited number of books, and oftentimes those might not be books that you have any interest in. But I did decide to pick Girl Won't Other by Bernadine Evaristo as the book that fit this prompt because it was long listed, or perhaps even shortlisted, for the Women's Prize in 2020, so it felt appropriate. I was going to read The Lacuna by Barbara Kingsolver, but I just didn't get around to it, and that was the only book that has won either of these prizes that I had on my shelves that I was extremely interested in. So that was probably the most challenging prompt, given that I didn't actually fully complete it. So that is my wrap up for all 24 of the Reading Women 2020 challenge prompts. As you can see, some of them I really enjoyed and thought that they were very easy to complete, and others I enjoyed but definitely had to struggle a bit with figuring out what books might fit the prompt, and then others I just didn't enjoy in general. So it was kind of a mixed bag for me, which I think is true of a lot of reading challenges, is that you're going to both read books that you otherwise wouldn't have read and really enjoy, and then read books that you don't like and knew you weren't going to like. I definitely foresee myself continuing to do the Reading Women challenge. I always find that the prompts they pick to be really helpful in kind of guiding my reading, but also encouraging me to read outside of my comfort zone. And so that is going to wrap up this kind of Reading Women 2020 wrap up. If you completed the Reading Women 2020 challenge, again, do let me know down in the comment section below. Additionally, if any of these books are books that you've read that you want to talk to me about, also let me know down in the comment section below. If you are new to my channel, I'd love to have you stick around and subscribe, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.